The host leaned forward and asked me where my work came from. It was a live podcast, 300 people in the studio audience, another 40,000 streaming. The microphone was close enough that I could see my own reflection in the windscreen, distorted and small. The lights were warm and slightly too bright, the way lights always are when someone wants you to look relaxed while making it physiologically difficult to be so. I had answered this question before. I had a version of the answer I used for professional contexts: clean, appropriately personal, emotionally accessible without being destabilizing. I had used it in conference rooms and keynote stages and smaller, quieter therapy offices where the question came in a different form but meant the same thing: why do you care so much about this? That night, for the first time, I didn't use the prepared version. My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 30 years old, and I am a psychologist and behavioral coach who specializes in identity recovery after chronic emotional invalidation. That is the clinical language for what I do. The less clinical language is this: I work with adults who were told, for long enough and by the right people, that they were fundamentally less than, and I help them understand that the verdict was never theirs to carry. The irony of my specialty is not lost on me. It is, in fact, the entire point. The host's name was Sandra Okafor. She had a reputation for asking the question underneath the question, and she lived up to it that night. She waded through a version of my prepared answer and then she said, very quietly, "But where does it actually come from, Wren?" The audience was very still. I looked at the camera. Then I looked at Sandra. And I thought about my mother's voice, the particular pitch and cadence of it when she was disappointed, which was often and which she communicated with the efficiency of someone who has never needed to raise their volume to land maximum damage. "You'll always be nothing," she had said. I was 11 years old. I had just shown her a drawing I was proud of, something I had spent 3 afternoons on, a landscape with a specific quality of light I'd been trying to capture for weeks. She looked at it for a moment and said those words with the same flat delivery she used for observations about the weather. I answered Sandra's question honestly for the first time. And the story I told that night, the real one, not the professional version, is the one I want to tell you now. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio called Delford, the kind of place that looks unremarkable from the outside and is, for most of the people who grow up there, exactly as unremarkable on the inside. Comfortable streets, a decent school system, the low-grade civic pride of a community that hasn't had anything exceptional happen in several decades and has largely made peace with this. My mother, Carol Calloway, was a woman of considerable social intelligence and almost no emotional generosity toward her older daughter. I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters. She was not globally cold. She was not a woman who failed to love anyone. She laughed easily with her friends, charmed people at school functions, maintained a reputation in Delford as someone warm and capable. At her best, in the right company, she was genuinely engaging. She simply did not extend those qualities consistently to me. My father, Dennis Calloway, was a civil engineer who worked long hours and came home tired and had developed, over years of living with Carol, a particular talent for not noticing things that required him to navigate her displeasure. He was not unkind. He was absent in the specific way of someone who is physically present and emotionally unavailable, who has chosen the path of least resistance and sincerely believes this is neutrality. My sister, Paige, was 3 years younger than me. Paige was blonder, easier, instinctively attuned to what our mother wanted from her and reliably willing to provide it. The dynamic between them was warm in a way that my relationship with my mother never quite managed, and watching it as a child produced in me a specific confusion, not quite jealousy, but something adjacent to it, the confusion of a child who cannot understand why the same parent feels different depending on which child she is looking at. I was, from an early age, the difficult one. Not in the ways that label usually implies. I wasn't rebellious or aggressive or particularly defiant. I was difficult in the sense that I noticed things and said so. I had questions. I had opinions that didn't always match the ones I was supposed to have. I drew pictures instead of playing the sports my mother had decided were appropriate, and I read books she found peculiar, and I had an interior life that was vivid and private in a way she found vaguely threatening, I think, because she couldn't manage it. The year I turned 8, she started saying things. Not constantly. That's important to understand. Chronic emotional invalidation at the familial level rarely looks like constant cruelty, that would be too visible, too obviously wrong, too easy to identify and protest. What it looks like is intermittent. A comment here. A look there. A comparison that lands with the weight of verdict. Spaced irregularly enough that the child begins to believe the problem is herself, that if she could just figure out what she was doing wrong, she could fix it. You're too sensitive. That was a frequent one. Said in response to tears, yes, but also in response to enthusiasm, in response to noticing things, in response to caring about outcomes. Sensitivity, in my mother's taxonomy, was a deficiency. Your sister doesn't make everything so complicated. Said when I asked a second question, when I pushed back on an explanation that didn't quite make sense, when I came home from school upset about something that required more than a surface response. I don't know where you get these ideas. Said about the drawing. About a story I wrote for a class assignment that the teacher had praised and my mother had read with the polite blankness of someone who has decided, in advance, that the thing is not impressive. The drawing comment, the "you'll always be nothing" comment, came on a Thursday afternoon in October when I was 11. I have tried, in the years since, to understand what preceded it. Whether something had happened that day that put her in a particular frame of mind. Whether there was a context I missed. I haven't been able to find one. I think it simply came out, the accumulated impatience of a woman who found her older daughter obscure and irritating, expressed in a moment of unguarded honesty that she probably didn't register as significant. I registered it as significant. Children are not good at hearing something like that and understanding it as a reflection of the speaker rather than the subject. They are, by developmental necessity, egocentric. They understand the world through the lens of what it means about them. I was 11 and I heard my mother's words as information about my fundamental nature. True information, delivered by the most authoritative source available. I didn't cry in front of her. That part one remember clearly, the specific effort of holding my face still, rolling the drawing up, going upstairs to my room. I sat on my bed for a long time looking at the wall. I didn't draw again for 2 years. School introduced a second layer to what was already happening at home. I want to be fair and say that not every person at Delford Elementary, and later Delford Middle School, made my life difficult. There were teachers who were kind. There were classmates who were indifferent in the benign way of children who simply don't notice you. But there was also a girl named Brittany Cole, who noticed me with the specific attentiveness of someone who has identified a target, and her attention was not benign. Brittany was the social center of our grade, confident in the way of children who have been told consistently that they are the most important person in the room and have never had cause to question this. She was not physically cruel. She was socially devastating in the particular way that girls at that age often are, through exclusion, through whisper networks, through the strategic deployment of laughter at exactly the right moments to communicate to an entire room that someone is outside the boundary of acceptable. I was, for 3 years of middle school, the person she practiced this on. The thing about sustained social exclusion at 12 and 13 is that it confirms what's already been planted at home. My mother had told me, in various ways, that I was too much and not enough simultaneously, too sensitive, too complicated, not easy enough, not right enough. Brittany Cole and her orbit confirmed this verdict with the particular authority of the peer group, which at that age feels nearly as significant as parental authority and in some contexts more immediately painful. I became, through this combination, a child who had learned to make herself small. Not physically, I was always more angular and tall than I wanted to be. But socially, emotionally, I learned to preemptively minimize. To self-deprecate before anyone else could. To lead with apology. To treat my own perceptions and feelings as probably wrong, probably excessive, probably better not mentioned. I thought this was modesty. It took me nearly 20 years to understand it was survival behavior I'd adopted so thoroughly I'd forgotten I'd chosen it. My father noticed, during the worst of the middle school years, that I had become quieter. He mentioned it once at dinner, "You've been very quiet lately, Bug," using the childhood nickname that felt, in that moment, like an anachronism. My mother said something about how teenagers needed space and changed the subject. My father nodded and passed the bread, and that was the end of it. That was the end of it. High school produced, unexpectedly, a partial reprieve. Not from my mother. Our dynamic had calcified by the time I turned 14 into something neither of us examined closely, a careful distance that functioned as armistice, conducted across the dinner table and through the logistics of daily life. She managed me with efficiency. I managed her with avoidance. We were not at war. We were not close. We occupied the same house with the particular mutual wariness of two people who have long since stopped believing they understand each other. What changed was school, and specifically a teacher named Mr. Alderman who taught AP English my sophomore year. He was in his 50s, unhurried, with the particular quality of attention that good teachers have, the kind that makes a student feel their specific ideas are being received rather than processed. He assigned an essay early in the semester on a text I found genuinely interesting, and he returned my paper with a comment in the margin that I still remember verbatim: "You see things other people walk past. Don't explain that away." I didn't know what to do with that. I read it 3 times. I read it in the way you read something that contradicts a belief you've held long enough that you've forgotten it's a belief rather than a fact. It didn't change everything. I want to be clear about that, because the narrative in which one teacher's kindness repairs childhood damage is a narrative that feels good and is not quite real. What Mr. Alderman's comment did was create a crack in the certainty, a small, specific doubt about the verdict. Not a reversal. Not a liberation. A crack. I started writing again. Not showing it to anyone, but writing, in notebooks I kept in the back of my closet, filling them with the kind of unstructured observation that I'd later understand was the beginning of what would become both my professional method and my personal survival tool. I wrote about what I noticed. About the gap between what people said and what their faces did. About the specific way my mother's voice changed when Paige walked into a room. Brittany Cole largely ignored me in high school, which I understood was its own kind of social commentary. I had become too invisible to be worth targeting. She moved through the social geography of our school with the certainty of someone whose position was secure, and I moved through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to need very little from the available social resources. I had 2 friends. Genuinely 2, not a friend group with a peripheral extended network, but 2 people who knew me, a girl named Simone who was quiet and funny and deeply uninterested in Delford's social hierarchies, and a boy named Eli who played violin in the school orchestra and whose family had moved from another state, which gave him the particular freedom of someone who hadn't been shaped by the local social architecture. Simone knew more about my home life than Eli did. Not everything. I had not yet developed the language to describe what my relationship with my mother was, in part because the language requires a framework and the framework requires the perspective of someone who has had enough distance to see the pattern. But she knew enough. She had been to my house enough times to have observed the particular temperature of the rooms when my mother was present, the way my posture shifted when Carol walked in, the micro-adjustments I made without appearing to make them. She never called it anything. She was 15 and didn't have the vocabulary. But she noticed. "Your mom looks at you differently than she looks at Paige," she said once, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor sophomore year. "I know," I said. It was the first time I had said those 2 words to another person about that specific thing. We didn't discuss it further. But saying it, even that small acknowledgement, was something. The college application process became the next site of conflict. I wanted to study psychology. My mother felt this was impractical, and said so with the particular authority she reserved for pronouncements about my future. She had decided, I don't know when, exactly, but the decision felt long-standing, that I should study business or education, something with a clear vocational trajectory, something she could explain to other people at Delford dinner parties without having to add qualifiers. "Psychology is for people who want to analyze everyone instead of doing anything useful," she said. We were in the kitchen. She was unloading the dishwasher, which was the activity she preferred for difficult conversations, something to do with her hands, something to look at besides me. I want to understand people, I said. Understanding people doesn't pay rent. I want to help people, I said. She set a glass down with a small, controlled click. You have a very high opinion of your ability to help anyone. I applied to psychology programs at 4 schools and was accepted to all 4. I went to the one farthest from Delford that offered the best program. I told myself the distance was about the academics. It was about the academics and it was also about the distance, and being honest with myself about both took several more years than it should have. The summer before I left, my mother said something that surprised me. We were in the backyard, early evening, and she was watering the garden she kept immaculate. She said, without looking up from the hose, I hope you know what you're doing. It wasn't warm. It wasn't encouraging. But it was a departure from the usual register of our interactions, and I stood there for a moment trying to identify what it was. I think it might have been the closest she could come to something she couldn't name. I don't know. I've thought about it many times since and I still don't know. I hope so too, I said. She nodded once and went back to the garden. I went inside. The first 2 years of my undergraduate psychology degree were, in the specific way of certain kinds of education, an experience of progressive destabilization followed by reconstruction. I was studying the mechanics of what had happened to me before I understood that what had happened to me had a name. Developmental psychology. Attachment theory. The literature on emotional invalidation and its downstream effects on self-perception, interpersonal functioning, and the internal working models people carry into adulthood from early caregiving relationships. I read these texts with the peculiar doubled attention of a student and a subject simultaneously, processing them academically while something else in me, something quieter and more personal, was performing a different kind of processing entirely. The framework arrived gradually, the way significant understandings tend to, not as a single revelation but as an accumulation of smaller ones, each adding a layer of clarity to something that had previously been experienced but not named. What had happened at home had a structure. It had a name. It was not, as I had believed for 18 years, evidence of my fundamental inadequacy. It was a pattern with identifiable components, identifiable consequences, and identifiable pathways towards something different. I didn't call my mother and tell her this. The understanding that something has a clinical name does not automatically produce the emotional capacity to confront the person who enacted it. What it produced, in the short term, was a quiet internal reorganization, the beginning of the long process of separating what was done to me from who I am. I found a therapist my second year. Her name was Dr. Annika Svensson, a woman in her 60s who had the particular quality of presence I would spend the next decade trying to develop in myself, the kind that makes a person feel fully received without being managed. She asked me, in our third session, to describe my mother. I gave her the careful version. The diplomatic version, with appropriate acknowledgement of complexity and context. She waited. I gave her a less diplomatic version. She waited some more. By the time I had run out of diplomacy entirely, I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was 11, without the containment I had learned to maintain, without the self-monitoring, without the preemptive apology. You've been explaining her behavior as your problem for a long time, Dr. Svensson said. Yes, I said. What would it mean to stop doing that? I didn't have an answer right away. The question opened into a space I hadn't looked at directly before, the space of what I might be if I stopped organizing my self-understanding around my mother's assessment of it. That was the beginning. It was slow and non-linear and painful in ways I hadn't anticipated, because the work of unlearning a belief about yourself that you've held since childhood is not a clean process. You don't simply decide to stop believing it and find it gone. You find it gone and then find it back. You make progress and then encounter something, a tone of voice, a throwaway comment from a stranger, a particular quality of silence in a room, that drops you back into the old architecture as completely as if you'd never left it. I went home for Thanksgiving my junior year and lasted 4 days. Not because anything catastrophic happened. My mother was, if anything, more controlled than usual, aware, perhaps, on some level, that something had shifted in me, though I hadn't told her about the therapy or the coursework or the slow reorganization of my internal understanding. She made her usual comments. Paige was there with her boyfriend, easy and warm, the family's emotional sunlight. My father asked about my studies with the polite curiosity of a man who is genuinely trying and doesn't quite have the vocabulary for the territory. On the fourth day, I overheard my mother on the phone with someone, a friend, I think, from the register of the conversation. She was describing Paige's relationship, her new job, her plans. There was the warmth I recognized, the unguarded pride. Then the friend apparently asked about me. Wren is doing her psychology thing, my mother said. A pause. Yes, still. She has very strong ideas about what she wants. Another pause, and then a small laugh. She always did. Even as a child. Very certain of herself. The way she said it. The specific inflection on certain, which transformed it from a quality into a flaw, a gentle mockery shared between two women who understood each other. I was standing in the hallway outside the kitchen and I pressed my back against the wall and breathed very carefully for a moment. Then I went upstairs and booked an earlier flight home. I didn't say anything when I left the next morning. I said I'd gotten confused about a deadline. My mother accepted this with the smooth ease of someone who has learned not to push for what they don't actually want. My father hugged me at the door and told me to eat enough. Paige waved from the stairs. On the plane home, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not notes, not coursework, just writing, the way I had in those notebooks in my closet at 15. I wrote about the phone call. I wrote about the hallway. I wrote about the specific quality of the shame that had moved through me when I heard my mother's voice, old shame, childhood shame, the kind that doesn't announce itself as external but arrives as a statement about yourself. And then I wrote, "This is not mine. This was never mine." I don't know if I believed it yet. But I wrote it. And writing it was something. The graduate program took me further from Delford geographically and further into the work psychologically. My clinical training involved sessions with real clients, adults navigating the specific aftermath of invalidating early environments, people who had arrived in adulthood carrying other people's assessments of them as if they were fact. Sitting across from them, I recognized things. Not my exact experience, but the shape of it, the way they minimized themselves preemptively, the way they apologized for taking up space, the way they presented their own perceptions with a hedge, a qualifier, a just-in-case disclaimer. I recognized it because I still did it. More than I wanted to admit. My supervisor during clinical training was a man named Dr. Patrick Ree, rigorous and precise and unexpectedly funny in the way that very serious people sometimes are. He observed my sessions and gave feedback and once, midway through my second year, said something I've thought about almost every week since. "You understand your client's experience very well," he said. "I want to ask you something. Do you give yourself the same quality of witness you give them?" I said I was working on it. "That's not a yes," he said. "No," I said. "It's not." Simone came to visit me twice during graduate school. She had gone into graphic design, built a small studio practice, married someone quiet and good. She knew about the therapy, knew about the academic work, knew more than anyone else about the full arc of what I was processing. On her second visit we went for a long walk along the river and she asked me if I'd talked to my mother about any of it. "Not directly," I said. "Are you going to?" I thought about the phone call. The hallway. The specific inflection on certain. "I don't know," I said. "I don't know if it would change anything." "Maybe it's not about changing anything," Simone said. "Maybe it's just about saying it out loud." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The distinction between confrontation as repair and confrontation as witness. The difference between going back to fix something and going back to name it. By the time I finished my doctorate and established my private practice, I was 30 years old and had spent 12 years in various forms of structured self-examination. I had sat across from Dr. Shrenson and then two subsequent therapists as my needs evolved. I had processed the childhood, the school years, the Thanksgiving phone call, the accumulated texture of a mother who could not give me what I needed and a father who chose not to notice. I had built a professional identity grounded in the specific experience of knowing what it felt like from the inside, and I had built personal relationships, with Simone, with colleagues, with a man named Tobias who had come into my life 2 years earlier with the particular quality of steadiness I had learned to recognize as trustworthy. I was, by any external measure, a woman who had made something real from difficult materials. And I was still, in certain moments, a particular tone of voice, a crowded room where I hadn't been introduced, a situation requiring me to take up more than my accustomed amount of space, still reaching for the old architecture. Still feeling, underneath the professional competence and the years of work, the 11-year-old who had rolled up the drawing and gone upstairs. That was the truth Dr. Shrenson had pointed me toward at 20. That was the truth Patrick Ree had named at 26. That was the truth I had been circling for a decade without quite landing at its center. The podcast invitation arrived in spring. Sandra Okafor's show, The Interior Work, which focused on psychological practitioners who used personal experience as the foundation of their professional practice. Sandra herself was known for the quality of her listening and the unwillingness to accept the prepared version of an answer. I accepted the invitation and spent 3 weeks preparing the professional version of my story. The studio was smaller than I expected. I had imagined something cavernous and the reality was almost intimate, exposed brick walls, warm lighting, 2 chairs angled slightly toward each other rather than facing directly, which is a deliberate choice and a good one. The audience seating was curved around the recording space. 300 people sitting with a specificity of attention that is different from a conference audience. They had come to hear something real, and they knew how to be still for it. Sandra Okafor was exactly as she appeared in her recordings, unhurried, specific, with a quality of engagement that made you feel she had no agenda beyond understanding what you were actually saying. She greeted me backstage with a handshake that was firm without being demonstrative and said, "I'm glad you came. I've been wanting to talk to you since I read your work." We sat down. The recording light came on. She introduced me with the precision of someone who had done her research, my doctorate, my practice specialization, the paper I'd published the previous year on identity reconstruction following chronic childhood invalidation, which had received more attention than I had anticipated and which had, I was beginning to understand, reached people who recognized themselves in its clinical language. She asked her first questions and I answered well. I was professional and accessible and appropriately personal, clinical enough to be credible, human enough to be engaging. I described the work, the population I served, the methodology. I talked about why the specialty mattered. I used the prepared version of my story in the places where personal disclosure was contextually appropriate. Sandra listened. Then she said, "But where does it actually come from, Wren?" The studio was very quiet. I looked at her. She looked back at me with the specific patience of someone who has asked the question she actually wanted to ask and is prepared to wait as long as it takes for the real answer. Something in me made a decision I hadn't consciously authorized. I felt it happening the way you sometimes feel a choice arrive before you've articulated it, a shift in the body before the mind has caught up. "My mother," I said. And I told the truth. Not everything, 30 years doesn't compress into 40 minutes, and some things belong to the therapy room rather than the public one. But the essential shape of it. The drawing at 11. The "you'll always be nothing," said in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that made it worse than shouting would have been. The way school had confirmed what home had planted. The years of making myself small. The long, nonlinear work of understanding that the verdict had never been an accurate assessment of my nature, it had been someone else's limitation, delivered to a child who had no framework to refuse it. I did not cry. I had cried, over the course of 12 years, enough times and in enough contexts that I had arrived at a relationship with this material that was not tearless but was also not desperate. I spoke about it with the particular quality of someone who has integrated something rather than merely survived it. The audience was still in a way that audiences rarely are. Not the stillness of polite attention, something more engaged, more personal. I could feel, in the particular atmospheric quality of a room full of people recognizing something, that I was not alone in this. Sandra asked, after a long pause, "Did you ever tell your mother what that did to you?" I looked at my hands for a moment. Then at Sandra. "No," I said. "Not directly." I spent a long time thinking the goal was to make her understand, to have the confrontation that would produce acknowledgement, and from acknowledgement, repair. But I eventually understood that I couldn't control whether she could hear it. I could only control whether I said it. "And did you say it?" "I wrote it," I said. "Last year. A letter." She didn't respond the way I hoped she would. She responded the way she was capable of responding, which is different. "What did she say?" I thought about the letter. My mother's response, 3 paragraphs, handwritten, on the floral stationery she had always used for correspondence. The careful language of someone who had been confronted with something uncomfortable and was managing it rather than receiving it. The acknowledgement that things had been difficult, reframed slightly as things having been difficult for the family. The pivot, near the end, to a reminder of everything she had provided, the house, the education, the practical scaffolding of a childhood. "She said she had always done her best," I said. Sandra nodded. "Do you believe her?" she asked. I sat with that for a moment. It was the question I had sat with, in various forms, for years. "I believe she did the best she was capable of," I said carefully. "I don't think her best was good enough for me." Both of those things are true simultaneously, and learning to hold them at the same time without needing to collapse one into the other, that's taken a long time. Something moved through the audience. Not a sound exactly. A shift in the quality of the attention. Sandra said, "What would you say to the people in this room who recognize their own story in yours?" I looked out at the audience for the first time since I'd started speaking honestly. 300 people in warm light. Some of them very still in the specific way of people who are working hard to keep their faces composed. Some not managing quite as well. I saw a woman in the third row with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, the gesture of someone who has felt something land directly. "I would say," I said slowly, "that you are not the verdict. You were never the verdict. What you were told about yourself by people who didn't have the capacity to see you clearly, that's information about them. It got inside you because you were young and they were the primary available source of truth, and that's not weakness, that's developmental necessity. But it's not fact. It was never fact." I paused. "And I would say that the work of understanding that is real work. It's not a realization you have once and then you're done. It's something you practice. You practice it in therapy offices and in conversations with people who see you clearly, and in the moments when the old voice comes back and tells you it was right all along, those moments especially. You practice choosing a different witness." The woman in the third row was crying. Not dramatically. Just the quiet kind, the hand still pressed to her sternum. "That's what I do for a living," I said. "And it's also what I'm still doing for myself." Both of those things are true simultaneously. Sandra Okafor looked at me for a moment. Then she smiled, not the professional smile of a host, but something more personal. "Thank you," she said. "For the real answer." After the recording ended, I stood in the backstage corridor for a few minutes before the meet and greet portion of the evening. Tobias had come, he was out in the audience, and I knew he would find me when the crowd thinned. I stood alone in the corridor with the particular stillness that arrives after you've said something true in a large room. My phone had 18 notifications. I didn't look at them yet. I thought about my mother. About whether she would ever see the recording, and if she did, what she would make of it. About whether that mattered as much as I had once believed it needed to. The answer I arrived at, standing in that corridor, was the same one I had been arriving at by a different route for 12 years, her seeing it was not the point. My saying it was the point. The witness I had needed most, in the end, was my own. I understood something in that corridor that I hadn't quite assembled before, despite all the years and all the work. The thing I had been waiting for, the moment when someone with sufficient authority would confirm that the verdict was wrong, that moment had already happened. It had happened every time I sat across from a client and recognized their experience. Every time Simone looked at me and saw me clearly. Every time Tobias said my name with the particular warmth of someone who knows who they're talking to. The confirmation had been arriving for years. I had just been looking for it in the one place it was never going to come from. The podcast episode aired 3 weeks after recording and reached, in its first week, more listeners than anything Sandra had previously released. The clip of my answer to the real question, the specific minute and 40 seconds from my mother through you practice choosing a different witness, traveled in ways that digital things travel, through shares and reposts and the particular attention of people who forward things to other people with the message "this is exactly it." My inbox became something I had to manage carefully. Not because the volume was unmanageable, my assistant helped with that, but because of the specific quality of what arrived. Messages from adults who had recognized themselves. From people using the language of clinical psychology and people using no clinical language at all. From people who had never told anyone what their home sounded like when they were 9, and who had written to a stranger on the internet because the stranger had said something on a podcast that made them feel less alone with it. I read them all. I couldn't respond to all of them personally, but I read them. There is a kind of witnessing that costs something to do properly, to receive someone's recognition without deflecting it, without minimizing it, without doing the thing I had spent 30 years doing with my own experience. I practiced it on their messages. I let myself be affected. Brittany Cole sent one. I want to tell you this carefully because it would be easy to make it either more dramatic or more redemptive than it was, and it was neither. She had found me through the podcast clip, she saw it shared by someone from our hometown, apparently, and recognized my name. Her message was 2 paragraphs. She said she remembered middle school differently than I might, which is the kind of sentence that tells you someone has some awareness of what they did and has not yet fully arrived at accountability. She said she was sorry if things had been hard. The if was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I sat with the message for 3 days. I didn't respond immediately, which was itself a small act of self-possession. The old reflex would have been to respond quickly, to be gracious, to manage her comfort. I took 3 days and thought about what I actually wanted to say. What I wrote was short. I told her I appreciated the message. I told her the experience had been real, that middle school had been genuinely difficult in ways that had left marks I'd spent years addressing. I told her I didn't need an apology with conditions in it, but that if she ever arrived at something less conditional, I would read it. Then I wished her well and closed the thread. That was sufficient. That was exactly sufficient. My mother did see the recording. Paige told me, which is how most information about my mother's reactions reaches me now. She had watched it, Paige said, and been very quiet afterward. She had said, to Paige, I didn't know she felt that way. I sat with that sentence for a long time. The specific grief of it, not my grief, but hers, maybe. The narrow window it opened onto a woman who had not understood, or had not allowed herself to understand, the effect of her words. Who was capable of watching her daughter speak publicly about 11-year-old damage and still framing it as information she hadn't possessed rather than information she had declined to receive. I did not call her. I wrote her another letter, shorter than the first, less clinical, more direct. I told her I had said what I'd said not to wound her but because it was true, and because truth has a way of eventually requiring a surface. I told her I wasn't asking for anything in particular from her. I told her I hoped she was well. She replied. 2 sentences this time. She said she loved me and she was proud of me, which she had almost never said before in any form. I don't know what to make of those 2 sentences entirely, whether they represent an opening or a managed response or something in between that doesn't have a clean name. I keep them without concluding too much about them. My father called me the week after the episode aired. He talked around things for several minutes in the way he has always talked around things, and then he said, I think I wasn't there enough when you were a kid. I want you to know I know that. It was imprecise and incomplete and it cost him something to say it. I could hear that it cost him something. I told him I knew he loved me. Which is true. And that love, in the absence of presence, had not been sufficient to protect me from what I needed protecting from. Which is also true. We talked for another half hour about careful things and hung up with something slightly different between us, not resolved, but shifted. A door moved a few inches that had been stuck for 20 years. Tobias made dinner the night after the episode aired. He did this the way he does most caring things, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, simply arriving at my apartment at 6 with groceries and spending an hour in my kitchen making something good. We ate at the small table by the window with the city sounds coming in from outside, and he said, at some point, I watched the whole thing again today. And? I said. You were exactly yourself, he said. Not as praise, exactly. As observation. As the specific kind of statement from someone who knows you well enough to know what it costs. I thought about that. Being exactly yourself. The specific achievement of it, for someone who had spent the first 18 years of her life understanding herself through someone else's inadequate assessment. The distance between you'll always be nothing and the woman sitting at that table, eating Tobias's cooking, with her work in the world and her name on a podcast that had reached 40,000 people was something true. The distance wasn't clean. It wasn't a straight line. It was the long, irregular terrain of therapy and writing and professional training and the ongoing daily practice of choosing a different witness than the one I'd been given as a child. But the distance was real. My practice grew substantially in the months after the episode. Not because I had sought the platform, but because the platform had reached people who needed the work, and the work was real, and sometimes those things find each other. I started a group program for adults in identity recovery, structured monthly sessions, curriculum-based, with individual coaching components. The first cohort filled in 4 days. I sat in the first group session and looked at 11 people who had come to this work from 11 different specific histories with the same essential shape, the experience of having been told, by people whose authority they could not yet question, that they were insufficient. Some had been told loudly. Some had been told quietly, the way my mother had told me. Some had been told by a parent. Some by a peer group. Some by a culture that had its own ways of communicating who belonged and who didn't. I told them what I told every client individually, but said it to the room, you are not the verdict. You were never the verdict. We're going to spend the next months learning to act from that understanding instead of just knowing it intellectually. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. An older woman in the group, late 50s, soft-spoken, who had driven 2 hours to attend, said, how long did it take you? For yourself? I thought about it honestly. I'm still doing it, I said. But it gets easier. And the gap between the old voice and the one you're building gets wider. One day you notice it's been weeks since you believed the old verdict. Then months. It never fully disappears. But it stops having veto power over how you live. She nodded. Something in her face shifted. That's enough, she said. That's actually enough to work with. Yes, I thought. It is. I still keep a notebook. Not the hidden kind, tucked in the back of a closet, a proper one, on my desk, used daily. I write what I notice. The gap between what people say and what their faces do. The way light changes over the course of an afternoon. The particular way Tobias looks when he's thinking about something. The small specific moments that add up to a life that belongs to me. I drew something last spring. Nothing technical, just a landscape with a quality of light I'd been watching from my window, the way afternoon sun hits the building across the street in April, golden and specific and gone within 20 minutes. I drew it in a notebook, spent maybe 40 minutes on it, then looked at it for a while. It was good. Not brilliant. But honest and careful and mine. I thought about the 11-year-old who had rolled up her drawing and gone upstairs. I thought about what I would tell her if the conversation were possible, not the clinical version, not the therapeutic framework, but the simple human version. You are not the verdict. That would be the beginning. What she couldn't see in you is not evidence of what isn't there. It's evidence of the limits of her vision. Keep drawing. Keep noticing. Keep writing in those notebooks you think no one will find. They will be the foundation of everything. I don't know if she would have believed me. Children rarely believe the version of themselves that exists outside the primary relationships assessment. But I would have said it anyway. Because saying true things, even when they don't immediately land, even when the listener isn't ready, even when the room is quiet and the authority figure's face is unchanged, saying them has its own value. It creates the record. It keeps something real from disappearing entirely. That, in the end, is what I do. In therapy offices and podcast studios and group sessions with 11 people on a Tuesday evening, I help people create the record of who they actually are, against the record that was created for them without their consent. It is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole work. What Wren Calloway said to her daughter at 11, "You'll always be nothing," is not primarily a statement about cruelty. It is a statement about blindness. The distinction matters because cruelty implies intention, and intention implies a choice that Carol may or may not have had available to her. What the story reveals more precisely is a woman who could not see her older daughter clearly and never developed the self-awareness to understand that her inability was the deficiency, not the child. This is the peculiar violence of the emotionally blind parent. They do not experience themselves as harmful. They experience themselves as accurate. Wren Calloway would not, if asked, have described her relationship with Wren as damaging. She would have described Wren as difficult, complicated, too sensitive, resistant to management. The behavior the story describes as invalidation would have been described by Carol as simply telling the truth. And herein is the trap that closes around children in these dynamics. The parent's certainty gives the damage the quality of fact. What Wren's story traces is the long process of dismantling a fact that was never a fact. This is different from recovering from an obvious injustice. It is more difficult, in some ways, because it requires not just healing from harm but fundamentally revising an epistemological system, the way you know things about yourself, the sources you have historically treated as authoritative, the internal methodology you apply to your own perceptions and experiences. Wren had been trained to treat her mother's assessments as more reliable than her own. Untraining that required 12 years of structured work and is, by her own honest account, still ongoing. The school environment's role in the story is worth examining as a system rather than as an individual. Brittany Cole was not acting in a vacuum. The social dynamics that allowed a middle school girl to effectively orchestrate another child's exclusion for 3 years reflected an environment that either did not notice or did not intervene. Children learn what behavior is tolerated from the responses of the adults around them, and the adults in Delford's school system appear, from the story, to have offered Wren one Mr. Alderman against 3 years of Brittany Cole. That imbalance is not accidental. It is structural. The father's role deserves its own category. Dennis Calloway did not hurt his daughter with words or actions. He hurt her with the specific absence of protection, the choice, made repeatedly over years, to not see what was in front of him because seeing it would have required him to act on it. This is the harm of the non-intervening parent. It is quieter and more deniable, and its damage is real. Wren's one moment with her father at the end, "I think I wasn't there enough," is more significant than its brevity suggests. It is imprecise and incomplete, and it represents, at 60-something, the beginning of an accounting he is only just beginning. The podcast moment is the climax the story builds toward, and what makes it work as a climax is that it is not confrontational in the conventional sense. Wren does not expose her mother to a room of 300 people. She exposes her own experience, which is a different act entirely. She claims the witness she was denied as a child, not from the person who denied it, but from the world she has built around herself in the years since. That is the form the reckoning takes, and it is quieter and more lasting than any confrontation with Carol would have been. What stays with me most about this story is something almost too small to name: a child who stopped drawing for 2 years. Not destroyed. Not prohibited. Just stopped. Because someone whose voice carried the weight of truth told her that her careful, specific, 3 afternoons-long work was evidence of her fundamental inadequacy. That kind of damage doesn't announce itself. It doesn't leave marks anyone else can see. It just quietly removes something from a child's daily life, a drawing, a question not asked, a sentence swallowed before it can be said, and the child reorganizes around the absence as if it were natural. What I think about is how many quiet reorganizations like that accumulate in a person before they even have the language to name what's been taken. And how long the path back to the original self can be: years, sometimes decades, of careful work to recover something that should never have been surrendered in the first place. Wren got it back. That's what this story is, at its core. Not revenge, not repair, not even reconciliation. Just a woman who picked up the pen again.